In the next example, again, we have to take the decision on what to exchange and what not to exchange, and if to exchange something or not. But before we discuss all the possible options, we should once again look at the position and look at the character of this position. It's clear that we have to take a decision based on the pawn on d5, because at some point we should capture back and possibly not lose that pawn by knight takes d5. So what we know is that we should win back the pawn on d5 without losing it. So it's clear at some point these two guys have to be exchanged for that reason. But apart from that, once the pawn is on d5, what we can say about the character of the position, we can say that white has space advantage. And now, when we play with space advantage, there are rules. And rules, once again, can be a good guide here to take the right decision, because when we play with space advantage, it's clear we don't want to exchange pieces because we have the space, so it's easy for us to maneuver around. Our opponent obviously doesn't have so much space, so the more pieces are in his camp, the harder it will be for him to maneuver around, the harder for him it will be also like to find possible and good moves and stuff like this. So that already means, according to this rule, to exchange both rooks is maybe not ideal. Also, we should take into account, once we capture on d5 without losing that pawn, then the only weakness remaining in black's camp is mainly the pawn on c7. Our knight will be able at some point to go to e6 to fix that weakness, but preferable, it would be good to have at least one rook on the board in order to also, take more pressure about the weakness. So also from this logical point of view, to exchange both rooks might be not a useful thing, because then the pressure on c7 is not so great. Yet we should check out the move, because maybe we win some material, so that's why it's always important to calculate the variations. Here, for example, like knight takes e8 would be a blunder because of knight e6, and he will not be able to solve this issue. So that's why rook takes e8 is forced, rook takes e8, knight takes e8, and here we have two possible moves. We can play knight e6 or c takes d5. Let's first check c takes d5, and here black is however able to exchange the knight and play something like king f7 and g6. Even so, our knight has no possible squares, because also like knight g7 has to be carefully considered how is the resulting pawn ending. But apart from that, black has enough moves to play around, and even if this king gets to b5, at this point the king will be on d7 or b7. It depends, and it needs of course some calculation. Black shouldn't have so much problems. So in general, we can say that this position will not be sufficient to play for a win for white. So let's go back and check out the other move, because instead of c takes d5, we have the move knight e6. After knight e6, here bishop has to move. There is bishop f6 and there is bishop e7. I believe, I'm not sure what to believe, but let's check even like bishop e7, c takes d5, and let's evaluate this position. And here I would say white, of course, is better, but maybe like it's not yet so clear, because okay, c7 is weak, but apart from that, there is no rooks on the board to take extra pressure on c7. That's why this solution could be satisfactory, but maybe there is something better. So that was the move rook takes e8. What else is left? Well, we have the move bishop takes f6, because according to the rules of calculation, captures, there are no checks here in this position, should be first regarded. So bishop takes f6, now the e8 rook is hanging, he has to capture on e2, take, and now bishop takes f6, and knight e6 is sort of logical, because if c takes d5, bishop takes g5, I doubt that we have here serious winning chances for white, because rook endings are always drawn, and no, I mean, joke aside, but they are very likely often to have better defending chances, and here we don't even have a pawn up. That's why the rook ending is definitely not attractive. So knight e6, and here, since already one pair of rook rooks had been exchanged, we have even a choice where to move around with our rook. And when we think a little bit deeper into the position, we see our sorrel child is c7. So there makes no sense to play a move like rook e8, even though it looks attractive because of the pin, because after c takes d5, we didn't change anything about our sorrel child. So that means we can try something like rook c8, which is more logical, and after c takes d5, there is a push c6, there is a push c5, but in both cases, Black improves his position because the weakness of c7 disappears, and even if you take, we have a weakness on d6, but now we see that the position is opened up. This square on e6 is not as strong anymore as a pawn on d5 is gone, and this rook has actually quite some nice counterplay along the c file. So that means if white doesn't take on c6 and stays as it is, then, well, he needs to find a new weakness. And d6 could be such a weakness, but let's be objective to get the knight somewhere on c4. I'm not sure how you want to do it. It's a long process and probably not even possible. So that means that bishop takes f6 is not bad, but it's also not ideal. And now, of course, the question is, what moves do we have left? C takes d5 looks very rubbish because, okay, rook takes c2, rook takes c2, knight takes d5, and not clear what we achieved but losing a pawn. So what is left after all the captures? Moves with a threat. And this could be knight e6. We have seen the move already like a couple of times in all the kind of variations, but to start with knight e6 is clever maybe, because now both rooks remain on the board. We have space advantage, so in general it's a good thing not to exchange pieces. D takes c4 is not enough compensation after knight takes f8, because okay, we will be an exchange up, plus there will be enough open files, so I think white simply is much better here and will win the game eventually with some decent technique, let's say. So instead of d takes c5, d takes c4, only rook f7 is, well, the option. But now you see, like, you know, how hard it is for Black to move around his pieces because of lack of space. So we can see only from this perspective, by just looking at it, it looks much more tempting than all the other lines, because this construction of Black here is not ideal. Now bishop takes f6 because we have to get back our pawn on d5. Bishop takes f6 and c takes d5. If we compare this position with the position when one rook was exchanged, we knew that Black had the possibility of playing c5. But here Black doesn't have the possibility because we can simply capture. So this is one huge difference. The other difference is, even if you try to reach the same thing by rook c8, we have enough time to prevent it with rook c2 or rook c1. So c5 will never ever be able to do. I mean, Black will never ever be able to play c5, and once the rook is on c2, it might even go to c6, so I block you forever. Then I double on the c file and I will slowly capture the guy on c7. In the game, Black played g6, which is, well, a kind of not unlogical move, but it's not easy here what to do because you don't have the space. So white played king f3. Well, he has time with rook c2, rook c1, so king f3 is a very normal move to centralize the king. a4 was played, trying to open up the a file to seek some counterplay, but anyway, for white not important because white already has the weakness to go for. Black took on b3 and played rook a8. Here another very logical decision, taking on c7 with a knight or with a rook. This rook is passive, this rook is active, so knight takes c7 is much more logical. Of course, we should take into account that here rook c8 would pin our rook, but after rook c2 there is not really an issue. So knight c7 was played in the game. Black tried rook a3 instead, now rook e3. Rook e7, once again, exchange, yes or no? The answer is quite logical. If we exchange, then b3 is, well, a problem. If you play knight e6, then our rook remains quite active and the rook on e7 remains quite passive. So, I mean, from this kind of logical points of view, it's very easy to take the decision here. Knight e6 was played in the game, and eventually also white won the game. For us, the rest of the game is not important. Besides, there is a mating threat with rook c8 and rook f8. But let's go back to the initial position. How to find knight e6? Here, actually, it's always good to look at the character of the position, plus to look into the future of what we want and what we don't want, which pieces we need to keep on the board, which not. And we saw with keeping at least one rook on the board, then we can hit on c7 much better. If we keep both rooks on the board, it's even better because of black's space disadvantage. So all these kind of, well, characters of the position plus the rules of, let's say, playing with space advantage, playing with a bishop pair, are very helpful tools to take the right decision about exchanging yes or no.